The strongest cadet in Spire 47 made one fatal mistake the morning Cassidy Rains walked through the bay doors. He smiled. Not the smile of someone welcoming a challenge. The smile of someone who had already decided how the story ended. Thakes the Vorton stood at the center of the arena floor with 4 arms crossed and gray skin that caught the overhead light like polished stone. He was the kind of cadet who had never lost a physical assessment in 3 years, the kind whose records were framed and displayed near the training bay entrance. I had walked past those frames every morning and never once questioned them. Until today, when I noticed one of them was crooked. Small thing, crooked frame, but Thakes was meticulous. He straightened his uniform between every drill. He aligned his gear with a calibration tool he kept clipped to his belt. A crooked frame on his own record wall was the kind of wrong detail that sat in your mind like a splinter you couldn't reach. I filed it away and turned back to the bay doors. She came through them without announcing herself. Cassidy Rains was medium height, soft-looking in the way that things built to survive tend to look before you understand what built them. No visible armor modifications, no augmented grip gloves. Her hands were plain and her eyes moved the way a scanner moves, slow pan, full sweep, no wasted motion, and she took in the entire arena in about 4 seconds before settling her gaze on nothing in particular. The room got quiet, not the respectful quiet that follows a high-ranking officer, the other kind, the kind that means the room has already decided something about you and is waiting for you to confirm it. Thakes uncrossed one pair of arms and let the other 2 hang loose at his sides. A relaxed posture, a predator's posture. He watched her the way you watch something you don't consider a threat. 3 tests later, the entire room realized they were the ones who had been played. Stay close. What you're about to hear changes the way you think about the word dangerous. 6 weeks before that morning, I had transferred into Spire 47's joint assessment cohort from a mid-tier evaluation track on Station Row. My name is Velcroth, blue-scaled species, Karathi academic record, unremarkable. I had been told politely and in writing that my physical aptitude scores placed me in the 43rd percentile for my class. I had been told less politely, and not in writing, that the 43rd percentile was where careers went to wait. The academy ran on a simple principle. The strongest candidates rose. Strength was measured in muscle density, reflex speed, bone tensile rating, and gravitational load tolerance. The Vortons scored highest on all 4. They had been scoring highest for as long as anyone had been keeping records, and the records went back a long time. Thakes was their best argument. On the morning Cassidy arrived, he had just posted a new personal record in the gravity shift simulation, the kind of record that got transmitted to the Marshall Vanguard before the cadet even reached the showers. He had spent the 40 minutes since his run accepting praise from the cadets who orbited him the way smaller bodies orbit something massive. Carefully, at a respectful distance, never quite at rest. I watched from the 3rd row of observation risers, my scales shimmering in that faint nervous way they do when I'm unsure if I belong somewhere. The light in the arena was the cool blue-white of a filtered star, and it made everyone look a little colder than they were. Cora, the Sarathi cadet who trained in the lane next to mine, had taken the riser seat to my left. She was watching Thakes with the specific kind of expression that means you are taking careful note of someone's weaknesses. Vorton assessment records, she said, not looking at me. Do you know why they're always the ones posted near the entrance? Because the entrance is the first thing you see, I said. Because the first thing you see, she said, is what you accept as the standard. I didn't answer that. She was right, and I wasn't certain what to do with it yet. The bay doors opened. Cassidy's entrance was not dramatic. That was the first thing I noticed. She wore standard-issue gray training kit, nothing modified, nothing upgraded. The Vorton cadets wore reinforced joint plating on their training gear, rated for the kind of force they routinely generated. She wore fabric. She had a small data tab clipped to her wrist, and she glanced at it once, briefly, the way you glance at a map when you already know where you're going. Thakes turned to look, so did everyone else. Softwilder, someone said from the 2nd riser. The word moved through the room like a temperature drop, not loud, not directed at anyone in particular, just placed there like a fact. Cassidy did not react. She walked to the equipment rack along the south wall and began doing a thing I had not seen a cadet do before an assessment. She read the weight stamps on the load bars, not the summary chart. The individual stamps, one at a time, running her thumb along the embossed numbers like she was checking for something specific. Thakes watched her for a moment, then looked back at his group. 3 tests, he said. I'll take the softwelder as my assessment partner. 3 tests. He said it the way you announce a demonstration, not a competition. Let's see how a Class 12 Deathworld girl handles a real evaluation. That got a laugh, not everyone, but enough. I want to stop here and tell you what I knew about Earth at that moment, which was almost nothing. I knew it was classified as a Class 12 Deathworld. That much was in the General Academy database. I knew humans had been admitted to the Joint Assessment Program after a decade of diplomatic pressure. I knew the Galactic Council's position was that human integration was a social initiative, not a military one, and that the phrase social initiative was the institutional version of the smile Thakes had been wearing all morning. What I did not know, and what I was about to find out, was what Class 12 actually meant. It means the planet tried to kill everything that lived on it, every day, without pause, and the things that survived did not survive because they were the strongest. They survived because they got better at the problem faster than the problem got better at them. I did not know that yet. I was still in the 43rd percentile, watching a human read weight stamps and wondering why Cora was smiling. Instructor Von Rech called the cohort to formation at the center of the arena floor. He was a Drathi, older species, gray-green skin that hung in calm folds, eyes that had watched enough assessments to stop being surprised by them. He carried a flat-form data board, and he did not look up from it while the cadets assembled. Joint partnership assessment, he said, paired physical and tactical evaluation, 3 challenge modules, scoring is cumulative. Partners are already assigned. He paused, with one exception. He looked up. Cadet Thakes has requested a voluntary pairing change. Cadet Thakes will partner with Cadet Rains for the duration of today's assessment. His voice carried no opinion. He looked back down at his board. Cadet Rains has accepted. I hadn't seen that happen. At some point in the 5 minutes since she walked in, she had agreed to be Thakes' partner, and I had no idea why. Cora leaned toward me from the riser seat. She agreed before he volunteered, she said quietly. I looked at her. She saw the request board when she came in, Cora said. She put her name next to his. The arena floor was 40 meters across and 6 meters high, and in that moment it felt very small. Thakes stood at the starting line for Challenge 1, 4 arms loose at his sides, and he was talking low voice, easy tone, at the group of cadets nearest to him. He was already framing the narrative, already building the story he planned to tell after. Cassidy stood 3 meters away from him at the same line. She had unclipped the data tab from her wrist and set it on the equipment rail. She rolled her left shoulder once, then her right, and then she was still. The gravity shift module was a 60-meter obstacle course built on a variable floor. The field generators beneath the panels could raise or lower local gravity at any point on the course, in any sequence, on a randomized timer. The idea was to test a cadet's ability to maintain momentum and balance when the physical rules changed without warning. For species like the Vorton, with 4 equilibrium organs and triple redundant proprioception, the shifts were manageable. Disruptive, but manageable. For a species with 2 legs, 2 arms, and a single inner ear on each side, the conventional wisdom was that you were fighting a design problem. Every time the gravity spiked, your body's balance system had to catch up from scratch. You would stumble, you would lose time, you would fight the floor instead of crossing it. That was the conventional wisdom. Von Rech raised 2 fingers, the signal for ready. Thakes rolled his neck once, 4 arms opened and closed in sequence. Cassidy looked straight down the course. Von Rech dropped his hand. Thakes moved the way a machine moves, all output, no waste. His lower arms drove him forward while his upper arms prepositioned for the first obstacle, a set of staggered balance rails at the 15-meter mark. When the first gravity spike hit at the 8-meter point, a 1.4x surge that would have buckled most cadets, he absorbed it across all four limbs simultaneously and barely changed pace. It was impressive, genuinely impressive, the kind of thing that had made those frames worth hanging. Cassidy moved differently. He didn't fight the gravity changes, she used them. At the first spike, she dropped her center of mass a fraction of a second before it hit, anticipating it, not reacting, and the surge pushed her forward instead of down. At the second change, a sudden reduction to 0.6x at the 22-meter mark, she went light on her feet in a way that looked almost careless, then used the low gravity to clear a 1.5 meter obstacle with a jump that should have been harder than it was. I watched her move and I thought, she has done this before, not this course, this problem, the problem of a floor that changes rules while you're standing on it. Thakes crossed the finish line and turned around, breathing controlled, forearms raised briefly in acknowledgement of the time. 7 seconds later, Cassidy crossed the finish line. She had beaten him by 7 seconds. The arena was quiet, not the polite quiet of a close finish, a different kind, the kind that happens when something doesn't fit the story that was already being told. Thakes stared at the timer display. His upper left arm went still, then his lower right. One at a time, they stopped moving. The simulation malfunctioned, he said. Von Rech did not look up from his board. The simulation is functioning correctly, he said. Cadet Rain's 7-second lead, moving to Challenge 2. Thakes turned to look at Cassidy. She was reading the weight stamps on the Challenge 2 equipment rack. Challenge 2 was the variable weight module. The principle was simple, a series of load stations, each with a different mass configuration, and a cadet had to move each load from a marked start position to a marked end position as efficiently as possible. Total weight moved in the shortest time. The scoring formula rewarded both volume and speed. For the Vorton, this was a home course. Thakes had a recorded lift total in this module that stood as the third highest in SciFi 47's history. His grip strength alone was rated at 3.2 times the galactic median. 4 arms meant 4 independent load points. He could move more mass per trip than almost any cadet in the academy, and he knew the layout of every station by memory. He walked to the first load bar without looking at the weight stamp. He already knew what it said. Cassidy looked at the weight stamp. Then she looked at the shape of the bar, then at the angle of the end caps, then at the load station itself, the height of the surface, the distance to the marked end point, the width of the path between them. Thakes lifted. 4 arms, clean drive from the legs, the bar going overhead in one smooth press. He walked the load to the end marker in 6 steps and set it down without any wasted motion. His form was correct. His efficiency was real. I had no criticism of it. He moved to the second station. Cassidy had not lifted yet. She was crouching at the first station, not at the bar but beside it, examining the junction between the bar and its resting cradle. I watched her press 2 fingers against the underside of the cradle mount and then look at her fingers, as if checking for something. Grease, friction material, I wasn't sure. Then she stood, gripped the bar in a 2-handed position with her hands placed not at the standard grip points, but about 1/3 of the way in from each end, and she pulled the near end of the bar off the cradle first, letting the far end drop to the floor, so the bar was now diagonal. She pushed the near end forward at shoulder height. The far end dragged and then lifted as the angle changed, and she walked the load to the end marker in 4 steps. It was faster than carrying it flat. Not by much, seconds, but this was a timed module. Thakes was at the 3rd station when Cassidy reached the 2nd. I leaned forward on the riser. Cora, beside me, had gone very still. The principle Cassidy was applying had a name. I did not know the name at the time. What I understood, watching her, was that she was using the weight's own mass and the geometry of the bar to reduce the actual work her body had to do. She was not trying to overpower the load. She was negotiating with it. Thakes was overpowering everything. At Station 4, he picked up a mass block that was rated above his recommended single-lift threshold, a yellow-stamped block, which meant use assistance or use both grip positions, and he lifted it anyway, alone, overhead, in one clean motion. It was extraordinary. His muscles moved under his grey skin like cables under load. 3 cadets on the floor level stopped what they were doing and watched. He set it down. He turned. Cassidy had already moved the same yellow-stamped block. She hadn't lifted it overhead. She had tipped it onto its shortest edge, rolled it along its own corner like a wheel, and walked it to the end marker in about 4 seconds. The block arrived undamaged, correctly positioned, fully compliant with the scoring rules. Her time at Station 4 was less than half of Thakes's. One of the cadets on the floor level said something I couldn't hear. The one next to him didn't respond. He was still looking at the yellow block. Thakes turned and saw Cassidy's completion marker light up at Station 5 before he reached it himself. For a moment, he stopped moving. Not long, half a second. His upper left arm came up and pressed against his chest, a Vorten gesture I recognized as involuntary, a physical reflex that happens when the body encounters something the mind hasn't processed yet. Then he moved again, faster now, harder. He was trying to win by being more of what he already was. She finished the module ahead of him. Not by seconds, this time, by enough that the scoring display updated and showed her cumulative total before he reached his last station, and the number was above his. A human, 160 pounds, approximately, from a Class 12 Deathworld, moving more mass than a Vorten elite, using nothing but the physics of the problem. Thakes stood at his final station with the bar in his hands, and his score already behind, and his 4 arms rigid at his sides, and his face showing an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger. Anger would have been easier. This was something quieter and harder. This was the look of a foundation developing a crack it doesn't know what to do with. He set the bar down at the end marker. He turned to Instructor Vonrech. "The scoring parameters need to be reviewed," he said. "The technique she used at Stations 2, 4, and 6 was outside standard assessment form." Vonrech made a note on his board. "The assessment specifies load delivery to the end marker. It does not specify method." He did not look up. Cadet Rains leads by a cumulative margin after 2 modules, moving to Challenge 3. Thakes looked at Cassidy. She was drinking water from a plain metal flask, and she was looking at the Challenge 3 staging area the way she had looked at everything else since she walked in full sweep, no wasted motion. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, loudly enough that the room heard, "You've been lucky twice." She capped the flask without looking at him. "Okay," she said. That single word landed in the arena like a dropped tool. Not defiance, not provocation, just a soft, flat acknowledgement that contained no fear and no interest, and it was somehow worse than anything she could have said back to him. Thakes had been building toward a reaction. He had wanted one. The machinery of his ego required an opponent who was fighting, and she had just declined to be one. I felt my scales shimmer, not the anxious shimmer, a different one. Cora turned to me. "Watch his hands," she said. I watched. Thakes's lower hands were pressing against each other, palm to palm, with steady, even pressure. It was a Vorten grounding technique, something you do when you need to reset your body's tension level. I had seen Vorten cadets do it between hard sets in the weight modules. I had never seen Thakes do it. He needed to reset, after 2 events, against a human carrying a plain metal flask and wearing fabric training gear. Challenge 3 was the Predator Survival module, and it was where Thakes had posted his best-ever score. The Predator Survival module was the Academy's most complex assessment. The staging area was a sealed environmental chamber, 40 meters by 60, with variable terrain. Some sessions used dense undergrowth configurations, some used open-floor urban arrangements, some used subterranean tunnel networks. Today's configuration was visible through the observation window in the staging wall, mixed terrain. Low cover, broken sightlines, uneven ground, and 3 simulated predator units, mobile, sensor-equipped, programmed with aggressive tracking behavior, running active pursuit patterns. The objective, reach the extraction point on the far wall without being tagged by a predator unit. Tags were pressure sensitive. A hit registered on the scoring board and ended your run. For species with high physical capability, the standard approach was to identify the predator positions, calculate the fastest path, and move through it at a speed that outpaced the pursuit. Brute force navigation. It worked, for species fast enough to execute it. Thakes had a reaction time in the top 4% of the cohort. He intended to run through. Cassidy requested a 2-minute observation window before the module started. Vonrach checked his board. Observation windows are permitted. 2 minutes, cadet reigns. She walked to the staging wall's observation port, a long, narrow window set at chest height, and she stood there and watched the predator units move through the terrain. 2 minutes, exactly. She watched the way she read weight stamps, systematically, without rushing, cataloging something. Thakes did not use his 2 minutes. He spent them stretching. When the timer called them in, Thakes entered on the left side. Cassidy entered on the right. The predator units adjusted, sensors sweeping. Thakes moved immediately. He was fast, genuinely fast. He identified the nearest predator's scan arc, timed his crossing of the open section to thread between 2 sweeps, and reached the first cover position in under 8 seconds. His form was exact. His execution matched his training. He was doing exactly what his biology and his education had prepared him to do, and he was doing it correctly. The predator unit turned and tracked him. He changed direction, it adjusted. He changed again, it adjusted faster. He had underestimated the tracking sensitivity on today's configuration. It was set higher than the standard he had trained against, and the adjustment rate was faster than his muscle memory accounted for. He was 2/3 of the way through the course when the unit tagged his right shoulder. The board registered the hit. Thakes stopped. He stood in the middle of the terrain with a pressure tag on his shoulder and 4 arms hanging loose at his sides, and he looked at the wall where the scoring board was. And for the first time since Cassidy had walked through the bay doors that morning, Thakes the Vorten was standing still without having chosen to. The predator unit moved away, resetting to its patrol pattern. On the right side of the chamber, Cassidy had not moved toward the extraction point. She had moved sideways. For the first 30 seconds after entry, she had been doing something that made no tactical sense by any framework I had been taught. She made noise, not accidental noise, deliberate noise. She scraped her boot along a patch of loose terrain material, then went still. She tapped the wall behind her with 2 knuckles, then moved 3 meters forward, then went still again. The nearest predator unit swung toward the sounds, adjusted its patrol arc, moved toward where she had been, not where she was. She had not run away from it, she had moved it. She did this 3 times in the first minute, and by the end of the first minute, all 3 predator units had been redirected, not neutralized, not avoided, but repositioned by her without her touching any of them. They were all in the wrong quarter of the chamber. She walked to the extraction point. She did not run. She walked. She reached the extraction point at 1 minute 43 seconds, tagged out, and the board lit up. The chamber fell silent in a way that the arena had not been silent before. The previous silences had been surprise or recalibration. This one was something else. This was the room trying to fit what it had just seen into a framework it had built over years, and the framework not cooperating. Thakes was still standing in the chamber. The extraction light was on. He had not reached it. He came out of the chamber, and he stood on the arena floor, and the scoring board was visible from every angle in the room, and his name was in the lower position and hers was above it, and it was not close. Cora said nothing. I said nothing. The cadets who had laughed at the word softwilder 40 minutes ago were looking at the board with the specific expression of people who understand that something has shifted and are not yet sure how far. Thakes's forearms were straight at his sides. His jaw was set. His grey skin had gone a shade lighter in the way that, I had learned, meant elevated blood pressure in Vorten physiology. He looked at the board for a long time. Then he turned to face Cassidy. She was toweling off her hands on the side of her training kit, not looking at him, not performing anything, just finishing. "That isn't how you pass a combat assessment," he said. His voice was controlled, just barely. She looked up. "I passed it," she said. "You manipulated the environment. You used the scoring rules as a loophole. You didn't demonstrate combat capability." She looked at him the way you look at a calculation that has the right answer but the wrong method. "Those predator units were running active pursuit," she said. "If I run, they chase. If they chase, they catch me. They're faster than I am, so I moved them before they had a reason to chase." She paused. "That's not a loophole. That's the problem being solved." "The problem," Thakes said, and his voice dropped a register, "is that you came into a combat academy and spent 3 events refusing to fight." "I came into a combat academy," she said, "and won 3 events." His upper arms moved, not a strike, not even close to one, but they moved, and the room noticed, and Instructor Von Rech took 1 step forward from the edge of the floor, and the single step was enough. Thakes stopped. He looked at Von Rech, then back at Cassidy. "You got lucky," he said. She picked up her data tab from the equipment rail. "You keep saying that," she said. She clipped the tab to her wrist and walked to the water station at the side wall, and the question she left behind was not anything she had said out loud. The question was, if it wasn't luck, what was it? And what did it mean that a creature from a Class 12 Deathworld had just done it in 3 events without once trying to match his strength? None of us in that room had an answer yet. But I could see, from the 3rd riser, that the crack in Thakes's foundation had gotten wider. Von Rech called it before anyone else moved. "Cohort formation." Not loud, he never needed to be. The cadets on the floor assembled fast, and the ones on the risers, including me, came down and joined the lines. Thakes took a position in the front row, which was his habit, and the fact that he moved to that position automatically, even now, even with the board still showing his name below hers, told me something about him. The front row was where he processed things. It was where he was most himself. Cassidy stood in the 2nd row. She had not chosen the back. She had not chosen the front. She had chosen the position that gave her the best sightline to Von Rech and the board at the same time. I filed that away. Von Rech looked at his data board for a moment, then set it down on the equipment rail, the first time I had seen him put it down during an active session. He looked at the cohort. "The assessment is complete," he said. "I want to tell you what you just watched, because I don't think all of you know." The arena was very quiet. Most of you assessed cadet reigns based on species origin documentation. Class 12 Deathworld, human. The Council's integration framework categorizes human cadets under social pathway admissions. He paused. That categorization is accurate in the administrative sense. It is not accurate in any other sense. Thakes's lower arms moved. Earth's Class 12 rating, Von Rech continued, was not issued because the planet has large predators. It was issued because the dominant species on that planet survived alongside large predators for long enough that the survival strategies became biological, embedded, not learned, inherited. He looked at Cassidy for a moment. She looked back. What you watched today was not a lucky performance. What you watched was a persistence hunter operate in a controlled environment. The word landed. Persistence hunter. I had heard it before, somewhere in an academy database entry, a footnote, something I had skimmed. Now I was not skimming. "Humans do not catch prey by being faster," Von Rech said. "They catch it by being relentless. They are built to keep going when everything else stops. Muscle fatigue that would end a sprint for most species is background noise for them. What looks like patience is pursuit. What looks like hesitation is calculation." He let that sit. Cadet Thakes spent 3 modules trying to outperform a species that was not trying to perform. It was trying to solve. Thakes said nothing, but his upper left arm pressed against his chest again, the grounding gesture involuntary. Cora was 2 places to my left in the formation line. She had not taken her eyes off Von Wretch, but she tilted her head slightly in my direction when Von Wretch said, "Persistence Hunter," and I understood that she had already known this. She had been watching Cassidy since she walked in, and she had already named what she was seeing. I wondered how long Cora had known about Earth. I wondered what else she filed away in that careful, quiet head of hers. Von Wretch picked up his board again. Challenge scores stand as recorded. Cadet Rains leads the partnership assessment. The results will be entered into the joint evaluation record by end of shift. He looked at the cohort, dismissed. The formation broke. Thakes did not move immediately. He stood in the front row position for a moment longer than everyone else, and then he turned and walked toward the equipment racks at the north wall without looking at the board again. He picked up a grip bar from the rack and held it in 2 of his hands, not to use, just to hold, and he stood there with his back to the room. I had never seen Thakes put his back to a room before. The mess hall that afternoon was louder than usual. Not because of anything that was said, because of what wasn't. The cadets who had been in the arena that morning were eating in groups that had shifted. I could see it in the seating. The Vorten cluster had pulled tighter. The cadets from the middle tiers, my usual range, were sitting differently than they had this morning, closer to the aisle, less settled. Cassidy sat alone. Not isolated, her table was in the center of the room, which is not where you sit if you want to be left alone. She had a tray, and she was eating with the same unhurried, systematic approach she applied to everything else. She worked through the food from one end of the tray to the other. No skipping, no preference order, efficient. Cora sat across from me and put her tray down without asking if she could join. "She chose that table on purpose," Cora said. "I know," I said. "She can see the door, both service windows, and the Vorten cluster from there. She's been watching the room since she sat down." I looked at Cassidy's tray. She was on the second item. She hadn't looked up since I started watching. "She's not watching the room," I said. "She's letting the room watch her." Cora was quiet for a moment. "That's worse," she said. Thakes entered the mess hall at the 20-minute mark of the lunch period, late for him. He was usually in the first wave, and he carried his tray to the Vorten cluster and sat with his back to Cassidy's table. I watched the cadets around him adjust. Small adjustments. They gave him slightly more space than usual. The way you give space to something that is still deciding what it is going to do. He ate without speaking for several minutes. Then one of the younger Vorten cadets, I didn't know his name, first year, eager to be noticed, leaned across the table toward Thakes. "She got lucky with the Predator configuration," the cadet said. "The tracking sensitivity was higher than standard. That's why your approach didn't work. It would have worked on the normal setting." Thakes looked at the cadet. The cadet held the eye contact for about 2 seconds, then looked at his food. Thakes said nothing. He finished eating, put his tray on the return rack, and left. The younger cadet looked at the Vorten cadets remaining at the table. Nobody agreed with him. Nobody disagreed with him. They just kept eating. That silence was the most honest thing that happened in the mess hall. I went to the observation deck that evening. The observation deck at Spire 47 was a long curved room on the upper level, with a transparent outer wall that looked out on the station's exterior ring, and beyond it, the star field. I went there sometimes when I needed to put distance between myself and a thought. The light up there was different, real starlight, filtered but present, nothing like the flat white of the training bay. Cassidy was already there. She was standing at the far end of the deck with her arms crossed and her scanner gaze moving across the star field the way it moved across every room she entered. Slow, systematic, not reverent, not philosophical, cataloging. I almost turned around. Instead, I walked to the observation rail about 4 meters from her and looked out at the same stars and said nothing. After a moment she said, without looking at me, "Blue scales." Velcroth, I said. I know, she said. She kept looking at the stars. Cora said you were the one watching my hands during the weight module, she said. I thought about denying it. Yes, I said. What did you see? I thought about what I had seen, not the technique. I could describe the technique, what I had actually seen. I saw someone who already knew the answer, I said. Before the test started, you read the weight stamps before anyone else moved, and you already had a plan. She was quiet for a moment. I read the stamps because the plan depends on the numbers, she said. The plan is always the same. The numbers change, she paused. Back home, we call it reading the terrain. You read what's actually there, not what you expect to be there, and you figure out what the terrain will do for you if you use it right. Same thing. That's what you did with the Predator units, I said. The Predator units were running pursuit logic, she said. Pursuit logic needs a target moving away from it. If you're not moving away, the logic doesn't know what to do for a second. That second is enough to redirect the unit. She looked at me then, for the first time since I'd walked in. Thakes ran away from them, so they chased him. That's how pursuit logic works. I looked at her. He was trained to run, I said. He was trained to run fast, she said, which is different. The star field outside the deck shifted, the station's rotation moving us past a new quadrant, and the light changed, and for a moment Cassidy's face caught it in a way that made her look older than she was. Not tired, worn in, the way surfaces get when they have been used a great deal. Thakes will challenge you again, I said. She uncrossed her arms. I know, she said. He won't accept today as a final result. His record wall is near the entrance. I wasn't sure why I was telling her this. He's been building towards something for 3 years. You walked in and changed what the building was for. People don't absorb that quickly. She was quiet. How long does it usually take? She asked. For Vorten, I thought about it. They're not built for revision. Their whole framework is based on a stable hierarchy. Strength at the top, everything else below. Today didn't just cost Thakes points, it broke the framework. Cassidy looked back at the star field. That's not my problem, she said. That's his problem. It becomes your problem, I said, when he decides to make it yours. She didn't answer immediately. Outside, the station's rotation had moved us past the bright quadrant, and the star field was darker now, deeper, a different quality of silence. On Earth, she said, there's a thing the old hunters used to do. If you knew something bigger than you was going to come at you eventually, you didn't wait for it to choose the moment. You chose the terrain first. You put yourself somewhere the size advantage stopped mattering. She looked at me. I've already done that. I thought about the table in the mess hall, center of the room, clear sightlines to every entrance. The observation deck at the end of the room, back to the wall, star field in front. Every position she had taken since she walked in this morning. She hadn't been navigating the academy. She had been setting terrain. I left the observation deck before she did. Walking back through the corridor toward the residential block, I passed the training bay entrance. The record frames were still on the wall. Thakes' records, same as always, same positions, same numbers. One of them was crooked. I had noticed it this morning and filed it away. Now I stood in front of it and looked at it properly. The frame was Thakes' gravity shift record, his personal best, the one that had been transmitted to the Marshall Vanguard before he reached the showers. The frame had been straight yesterday. I had walked past it yesterday and it had been straight. Someone had made it crooked. Not randomly, the angle was precise, maybe 3 degrees off horizontal, which is enough to notice, but not enough to be certain you're not imagining it. The kind of adjustment that plants a question without demanding an answer. I stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then I thought about Cassidy reading the assessment request board when she first walked in, reading it before Thakes volunteered, putting her name next to his before he had the chance to make it his idea. She had arrived at this academy, and the first thing she had done, before the assessment, before the challenges, before any of it, was choose her terrain. The crooked frame was the first move, and Thakes had never noticed. I was still standing there when Cora came around the corner from the direction of the residential block. She stopped when she saw me looking at the frame. She looked at the frame. She looked at me. "When did you figure it out?" she said. "Just now," I said. "I figured it out during the wait module," she said, when she knew which stations to use the leverage technique at before she got to them. She had already mapped the equipment layout. She came in knowing the course. Cora looked at the crooked frame again. The question is how long before she arrived. That question sat between us in the corridor for a moment. The frame was crooked. Thakes' best record, 3 degrees off horizontal. A persistence hunter's first move, placed before anyone in this building knew she was coming. How long before she arrived? The crooked frame stayed crooked all night. I know because I checked it in the morning, before formation, before the mess hall opened, before anyone else was in the corridor. I walked to the training bay entrance at 5:10 and stood in front of Thakes' gravity shift record, and it was still 3 degrees off horizontal and nobody had touched it. That told me something. Either Thakes hadn't noticed, which seemed impossible given the calibration tool he kept clipped to his belt, or he had noticed and had not straightened it, and I wasn't sure which answer was harder to sit with. I filed it away and went to formation. The morning assessment block was a lecture session, tactical theory, held in the upper classroom tier above the arena floor. Instructor Von Rech ran these sessions the same way he ran everything, without performance, without dramatics, working through material the way you work through a long calculation, one step at a time, no skipping. Today he did not open with the scheduled material. He stood at the front of the room and looked at the cohort for a moment, that specific Drathi stillness, the kind that is not emptiness but patience, and then he set his data board face down on the table beside him. "Yesterday," he said, "several of you formed a conclusion before an assessment began. I want to address that conclusion directly because it is a tactical liability, and this is a tactics program." Nobody moved. The conclusion was this: that biological advantage is the primary variable in a combat assessment. He looked at the room. "It is a variable. It is not the primary one." He paused. "The primary variable is the one you don't account for. Whatever you have left out of your calculation, that is where you lose." Thakes was in the front row, same as always. I could only see the back of his head and the set of his shoulders and the way his lower arms were resting on the desk surface with too much stillness. Not relaxed, held. "Cadet Rains," Von Rech said. She was 4 seats to the right of center. She looked up. "What is a persistence hunt?" A few cadets shifted in their seats. The question was directed at her, not at the room, and it was not a difficult question for her. She had lived the answer, but something about being asked it in front of the cohort carried a different weight than demonstrating it on an arena floor. She answered without hesitating. "You follow something until it can't run anymore," she said. "You don't have to be faster. You have to be willing to keep going after the thing you're following has decided to stop." Von Rech nodded once. "And what stops first?" he said. "Speed or will?" She looked at him. "Will," she said. "Always will." The room was quiet in the way it had been quiet several times yesterday. The quiet of something being filed away, recategorized, moved from one shelf to another inside a framework that was being quietly rebuilt. Von Rech picked up his data board. "Open to Chapter 9, he said. "Adaptive Engagement Theory. We will be covering it in full today, and we will be covering it again at the end of the rotation, and the cadets who understand why will perform differently on their final assessments than the cadets who do not." He began the lecture. Thakes did not speak during the session. This was unusual. He was not a talkative cadet. He had the specific silence of someone who considers most conversation beneath his focus level, but he engaged during tactical lectures. He asked precise questions. He challenged framings he disagreed with, respectfully but directly. His record in the academic modules was as strong as his physical record, which was part of what made him formidable. He was not just strength. He had built a complete argument for his own superiority, intellectual and physical, and he had been making that argument for 3 years with a consistency that made it feel like fact. Today he sat with his arms on the desk and his eyes on Von Wretch, and he said nothing. I watched him the way I had been watching things since yesterday, with the specific attention that Cassidy had made me aware I was capable of, the kind where you stop looking for what you expect and start looking for what is actually there. What was actually there was a cadet sitting in a front row that no longer fit him the way it had fit him yesterday morning. The front row was where Thakes processed things. He had moved to it automatically after the assessment, out of habit, out of the muscle memory of 3 years. But muscle memory is not the same as comfort, and the front row of this classroom was not the same room it had been 24 hours ago, and Thakes was sitting in a position that his body had chosen before his mind had finished deciding whether it still made sense. He stayed there anyway. That told me something too. After the lecture block, the cohort had a 90-minute break before the afternoon physical rotation. Most cadets used it for the mess hall or the study alcoves along the residential corridor. I went back to the observation deck. Cassidy was not there this time. The deck was empty except for the star field and the low ambient hum of the station's environmental systems, and I stood at the rail where I had stood the night before and looked at the same stars that had been there then, which was obvious but felt worth noticing. I thought about what she had said. The plan is always the same. The numbers change. I had been in the 43rd percentile since my first evaluation at Station Row. The number had been given to me like a classification. Here is what you are, here is where you belong, here is the range within which your future is likely to exist. I had accepted it the way you accept a fact you didn't choose. The 43rd percentile was not where I wanted to be, but wanting and being are different measurements, and I had always understood myself to be in the category of the latter. What I was sitting with, standing at that rail, was the question of whether I had been measuring myself against the right calculation. Thakes had measured himself against biological metrics and come up correct for 3 years. The metrics were real. His advantages were real. The measurement system had not been wrong, it had been incomplete. It had left out the variable it couldn't quantify, which was what happened when you introduced a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history solving problems that should have killed it over and over until the solving became the inheritance. The 43rd percentile measured what I could lift and how fast I could run and how quickly my reflexes processed an incoming stimulus. It did not measure what I did with the space between noticing and reacting. It did not measure what I filed away. It did not measure the crooked frame. I had noticed the crooked frame before anyone else in that corridor. I had noticed Cora's expression before she said anything. I had watched Cassidy's hands during the weight module and named what I was seeing before I had language for it. The calculation was incomplete. I was not sure what to do with that yet, but I was filing it. Thakes found Cassidy in the equipment corridor outside the physical rotation hall, 20 minutes before afternoon session. I was there because I had stopped to recheck my grip calibration on the way in, which took longer than it should have, because I was doing it carefully for the first time instead of by habit. I was behind the secondary rack when Thakes came through the side entrance, and I stayed where I was, not by decision, just by the specific stillness that happens when you sense that a situation has entered a phase that does not need a third party. Cassidy was at the far end of the corridor, running a tension check on a resistance band she had borrowed from the equipment room. She heard him come in and did not turn around. "I want to understand something," Thakes said. His voice was different than it had been yesterday. Yesterday it had been controlled with effort, the careful voice of someone managing a structure that was developing fractures. This voice was quieter, not calm exactly, but quieter. "Okay," she said. She kept running the tension check. "The frame," he said. She stopped, her hands stayed on the band, but they stopped moving. I found it this morning, he said. I've been trying to work out when you would have had access to the corridor without being on record. A pause. You came in on the shuttle that arrived at 3:20. The corridor cameras have a 12-second rotation gap at 3:40. The frame was logged as straight on the previous day's maintenance sweep. Cassidy set the resistance band down. She turned around. She looked at him, the scanner look full sweep, and then she said, "You worked out the camera gap." "Yes." "That's not a reflex," she said. "That's analysis." Thakes said nothing. "You spent the night working backward through the corridor access logs," she said. "You didn't ask anyone to do it. You did it yourself." She looked at him steadily. "That's not what someone does when they think the problem is that the simulation malfunctioned." The equipment corridor was narrow, and the sound in it was close. The ventilation above them, the faint hum of the resistance equipment along the wall, the distant echo of cadets assembling in the rotation hall beyond the door. Thakes stood in the center of it, with 4 arms at his sides and gray skin that caught the service, lighting the way it had caught the arena light yesterday morning, and he was not the same thing in this light that he had been in that one. Something had finished cracking. "You came here before we knew you were coming," he said. "It was not a question." "Orientation documents are filed 30 days in advance," she said. "The equipment inventory is public record. The assessment module configurations rotate on a posted schedule." She paused. "I read what was there." "You read the terrain," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. Thakes was quiet. "I stayed behind the secondary rack, and I was aware that my scales were doing something I had not felt them do before, not the anxious shimmer of uncertainty, not the faint, nervous disco ball flutter that had followed me into every room I'd been unsure about. They were still, fully still, in a way that felt less like the absence of anxiety and more like the presence of something that had replaced it. Something that did not have a name yet in my understanding of myself, but that felt like the specific stillness of a foundation that has been stress-tested and has not moved. "I'm going to challenge you again," Thakes said. "I know," she said. "Not today." "I know that too." He looked at her. Whatever he was looking for, I couldn't tell if he found it. But he stopped looking, eventually, and straightened his lower arms, and turned toward the door to the rotation hall. At the door, he stopped. "The frame," he said, without turning around. "I straightened it this morning." Cassidy picked up the resistance band. "I know," she said. "I checked." Von Retsch held an unscheduled observation at the end of the afternoon rotation. Not an assessment, not a drill. He stood at the edge of the arena floor with his data board, and he watched the cohort work through their individual training sets, and he made notes, and he said nothing for 40 minutes. At the end of the 40 minutes, he called the room to attention. "I want to say one thing," he said, "and then we are done for the day." The cohort assembled. SciFi 47 has produced 43 cadets who have gone on to active Marshal Vanguard placement in the last 6 years. Of those 43, 11 were Vorten, 14 were Sarathi, the remainder were distributed across 9 other species. He looked at his board. Of those 43, the 3 with the highest field performance ratings over their first deployment cycle were not the top physical scorers from this program. He looked up. They were the top adaptive scorers. The cadets who changed approached fastest when the situation changed. Nobody moved. "The galaxy," he said, "does not run on standard assessment configurations. It runs on variables you didn't prepare for. The cadet who understands that is more dangerous than the cadet who is strongest." He looked at the cohort, not at Cassidy specifically, not at Thakes specifically, but at the room. "We have a new variable in this cohort. I recommend you learn from it." He picked up his board. "Dismissed." I walked back through the training bay entrance, alone that evening. The frames were on the wall, same as always. Thakes' records, his gravity shift personal best, straightened now, exactly horizontal. The numbers were the same as they had always been. The records were real, the achievements were real. But the frame that had been crooked was the first thing I saw, because it was the first thing I looked for, and that was new. Behind me, I heard the bay doors open. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I had learned, in the past 24 hours, to read what was actually in a room without looking at it directly, and what was in this one was a cohort that had woken up this morning with a different understanding of the word dangerous than it had gone to sleep with, and was still working out what to do with the difference. That process was going to take longer than a day. Possibly much longer. My scales went stone still. Not the shimmer of fear, not the nervous disco ball flutter of a cadet in the 43rd percentile who wasn't sure he belonged in the room. Something else entirely, the cold, flat clarity of a new calculation, one that accounted for variables I had not thought to include before yesterday morning, when a human from a Class 12 Deathworld had walked through bay doors that had already been studied, through a corridor that had already been mapped, past a frame that had already been moved. She had set the terrain before any of us knew there was a game. The galaxy was learning. Slowly, one frame at a time, one cracked foundation at a time, one stunned silence at a time, the galaxy was learning never to underestimate the quiet ones. Especially the ones from a death world.